It's important that you understand these unspoken wood turning mistakes. Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today I'm going to cover 7 unspoken wood turning mistakes. These don't get shared very often and they can be very frustrating at a minimum and sometimes very dangerous if you don't understand them. Now you might know some of these, but my guess is there are several or many of these that you don't know, and it's going to save you a lot of time and headache and potential pain once you understand them. So let's jump right in with the first unspoken mistake that's very common. So how did you get started wood turning? Well, if you're like me, you probably did a whole bunch of other woodworking and you got curious about wood turning. What's it all about? But there were a lot of hurdles getting to wood turning, such as acquiring a lathe and really understanding what you need to do when you're turning, because it's really different than traditional woodworking. And one of the big things that gets carried over from woodworking is the wood itself. We want to do the same habits. It's just human nature. We know something, we want to repeat it. So what did we do when we were doing traditional woodworking, or flat woodworking as it's called, where we're taking pieces of wood usually and assembling them to make something? What did we start with? We typically went to a store, whether a hardware store, a lumber store, and we purchased wood to start our project. Well, guess what? You don't have to do that when you're turning wood on the lathe, or especially when you're turning wood bowls. 9 times out of 10, you're not going to find big chunks of wood large enough to make beautiful bowls with at any kind of lumber store. Instead, you're going to use raw timber. Now, the general thinking, the big carryover from woodworking is, well, that wood has to be completely dry before I can use it. And that is absolutely not true with wood turning. And it's a big mistake if you get a really beautiful log, say your neighbor's tree comes down and you get this great chunk of wood and you think, oh, I'm just going to set that aside and let it dry completely. Well, guess what? It's most likely just going to disintegrate, crack apart, and be useless. Instead, we can actually turn while the wood is green or wet, and it's a lot easier to turn when it's wet as well. So you definitely want to embrace using wet wood when you're turning on the lathe. This is totally unlike traditional wood turning, because if you think about it, when we put pieces of wood together to make something, say a cabinet or a box or something, if that wood's wet, it's going to warp and distort, and it's going to probably break apart your connections, and it's going to be awful in the long run. With bowls, however, there is movement, yes. That movement can be controlled and it can be minimized, and you don't have to have that movement in your bowl. There's ways around that. It's all about managing the wood properly, but you definitely want to embrace using wet wood when turning on the lathe, and don't have a limited mindset in thinking you only turn dried wood. And keep in mind too, even if you purchase bowl blanks, if you purchase a blank like this, for instance, you can buy these online from different companies. If you buy a bowl blank like this, it may look like it's completely dry, but there's most likely moisture inside still. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in another common mistake that's coming up. The next common unspoken mistake is to think that a bowl gouge is a scraper. It's very common, especially if you started using scrapers, such as a carbide scraper like this, to think that you simply take any tool and apply it into the wood and let it scrape the wood away. If you do that with the bowl gouge, you're going to get a nasty catch, because that's not how a bowl gouge is designed. A bowl gouge is designed to be cut on a bevel, using the bevel as a guide to go down the surface it's being cut. In other words, what we're doing is we're applying angles to how we engage the bowl gouge. Now, don't worry if this sounds complicated, or if you're thinking, well, why don't I just use this scraper? Because the scraper looks like it's super easy. Well, it is easy, but the overall quality you get from a scraper is not as great as you will get from a bowl gouge. It is worth learning a traditional bowl gouge. Now, I've got a course called Bowl Gouge Mastery that will teach you everything you need to know to master the bowl gouge. You might want to check that out. But just know that we do not just simply stick this into the turning wood and expect it to do anything. It will not work. It will make a nasty catch. It's going to be frightening, and it's just not good. Don't just jab this into a turning piece. You have to apply angles, and we're using this cutting edge to slice the wood instead of scraping it. It's a big difference compared to a carbide scraper in overall quality, and it's well worth learning how to do. So just remember, do not stick this into your piece thinking it's a scraper. Is it still here? Oh yeah, there it is. Please click that like button. Thank you. Okay, this is a big one, and I've seen this more times than I wish I did, because it is unfortunate, especially with all the time and effort that's put in. Usually when we first start turning bowls, it can take a long time before we get this shape done properly with our tenon and our shoulder. And it's really easy to think, whew, that was a lot of work. I need to take a break. And many times that break might be for a day or two or even a week. Now, I got to learn around a bunch of other turners, and I saw people do this pretty regularly. And because we met once a week, it was very frequent that people would wait an entire week. So in other words, they would turn the outside of the bowl, they would make their tenon, and that might take a long period of time, and they would just stop. And they'd say, okay, I'll bring this back next week and I'll finish it. Well, guess what happens? Yeah, it's cracked and it's distorted. At a minimum, it's distorted. Because why? Well, all big chunks of wood have moisture in them, and they're going to distort. And if you leave the interior solid, there is moisture most likely in the core of this. How much moisture? Nobody knows. It may be a small amount, it may be a large amount. But what's happened is you've exposed the exterior of this wood. Now, all of these end grains, especially on the end grain area, are exposed, and that moisture is quickly leaving that area. But guess what? It's still trapped in the inside. So the moisture leaving the sides is drying out the exterior of this bowl, and the interior is still wet. It's still staying contracted, and it's going to crack. It's really unfortunate, but it happens very often. Now, the solution is simple. Just turn the entire piece all at one time. Again, when you start out, it may take a long time, but make the commitment that you're going to turn the exterior and hollow out or core out the interior. Now remember, you can make a twice turn bowl. I've got a video all about twice turn bowls. You can check that out. You could twice turn it, which is kind of a roughing process. But what you want to do is you want to remove that core, and you want to make the walls evenly thick. That way the piece dries evenly. If you leave a great big chunk of wood sitting around for a length of time, it's most likely going to crack. Now, in super dry environments, such as in the high mountains and that, you may have to wrap your piece with plastic to prevent the moisture escaping the in-grain areas that you just cut. When you just maybe take a bathroom break, that's how fast the material can dry. So if the drier environments, you need to work even quicker to prevent that cracking from occurring. And you might get away with wrapping it with plastic, but don't expect that to last very long, like days or a week. It probably won't. And you're going to want to get the entire thing turned. So the solution is turn the entire bowl, both the outside and the inside, all at one time, so it's done and it's drying evenly, and you should have less cracks. This next unspoken mistake or misunderstanding is about the tenon. Now, one big thing we need to keep in mind is we are not machining metal here, and we're using our hands, so the precision is not as precise as we would find in maybe a metal lathe, where we have a very controlled material and a very controlled cut that we're making. And it's really common to turn a tenon and a shoulder and then reverse this bowl and mount it into the chuck, and to see that there's a little bit of wobble. Now, I'm kind of exaggerating it to give you an idea, but there's sometimes a little bit of wobble. Well, guess what? We're turning a plant. This is essentially a growing tree that is organic. Yes, it's relatively solid, and if it's dry, it's pretty intact, but we have to remember that this is not like steel, and it's not going to be super, super precise. And it's very common to have a little bit of a imbalance when we mount that to the chuck. Now, how do we fix that? One of the quick ways to do it is simply loosen the chuck and just rotate maybe a quarter or an eighth of a turn, and tighten it up again, and then see if it turns true or there. Now, another thing to keep in mind is don't take your chuck and clamp it down so tight that it's crushing the wood fibers. If that's the case, it's most likely crushing them unevenly, and you're going to see a wobble from that. If you're still having issues, try turning, loosen it and try turning it just a little bit more. You're going to find an area that seems to turn a little bit truer than others. It's just common because you have a piece of organic material here. Again, this is not a piece of aluminum or something that's uniform and perfect. This is an organic piece. Now, keep in mind too that if you're doing something that's really thin and you have a big wobble, if you don't do something to true that up, then you're going to have an uneven wall thickness, because where it wobbles in, you're going to cut down and you're going to have a really thin wall there, and where it wobbles out, you're going to have a thicker wall. So what you're going to want to do in these situations is mount this as true and as balanced as you can make it. If you're still seeing a wobble, you're going to want to make scraping or shear scraping cuts on the exterior of the bowl first and smooth this out. Now, when you smooth it out after it's already been mounted to the chuck, then it's turning true. Your exterior is turning true, and then when you turn the interior, it's going to be cut true to match that as well. So that's the real workaround, is you basically work that exterior a little bit more after you've mounted into the chuck to make sure that you take out any severe imbalances, especially if you're making a really thin-walled bowl. So keep that in mind. Rarely are you going to mount a bowl in a chuck and have it turn perfectly true and round the first time. Here's something that does not get shared enough, and this is really important. When you're turning your bowl and you get down to the final shape, thick and thin differences in your bowl will equal cracking most likely. Now, you might be able to get away with it with certain species of wood, or if your wood is very dry and the conditions are just right. But in general, if you make uneven thicknesses in your walls of your bowl, you're going to have issues. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a bowl like this, for instance. There's nothing wrong with this bowl, but what's happened with this bowl is I have varying thicknesses in the side walls, and the base of this is really thick. Okay, now, if this were wet wood or extremely wet wood, what's going to happen is what we talked about earlier, is there's going to be more moisture trapped in that thick area than the thinner side walls, and it's most likely going to crack because the thinner areas will dry first while the thicker areas aren't drying as quickly, and you're going to have that tension and that contrast. So you want to make your walls evenly thick. Now, if you've seen me turn bowls like this, and you've seen me work the base of a bowl, well, guess what? This isn't just for aesthetics and to make the bowl look nice. Yeah, it looks really good. But the reason I turn out the foot of the bowl is that the bottom of the bowl is essentially a continuation of the side walls as far as the thickness from the very bottom of the bowl to the very center of the bowl. That's about the same thickness as the side walls. And guess what? The foot, or the rim that makes up the foot, is essentially the same thickness as the bowl itself. What happens then is, especially if you're turning really wet wood, this wood is basically going to release this moisture evenly, and you have a less chance of it cracking. It's essential to maintain even wall thickness from the top rim all the way through the bottom of the bowl and even with the foot of the bowl. Now, just keep in mind that uneven bowl thickness will usually equal cracking, and you're probably going to want to avoid that. This unspoken mistake is potentially very dangerous. I get letters all the time that explain this situation, and I cringe every time I hear this. Now, it's really common because what happens? Well, again, we start typically doing woodworking. We have a variety of different tools, and we need to acquire a lathe. Many times we'll have somebody give us a lathe, or we'll find a really good deal on a lathe at a garage sale or something like that, and think everything's great. We'll bring that lathe home, and I'm going to start making amazing things, especially incredible bowls. Well, there's a little bit of a problem. Most of the lower priced lathes are direct belt driven, meaning there's an electric motor and a belt that turns the spindle for the lathe, and there's basically nothing to adjust that. Meaning when you turn the lathe on, it's turning at full force. Now, typically you can change those pulleys so you have different torque and it will change the RPMs, but most of the inexpensive lathes can't get the RPMs down low enough to safely turn a bowl. Now, what does that mean? Well, because we're turning a larger mass, because we're turning something that has a larger size and weight potential, we have to turn this slower. Now, this is another thing that happens frequently is many people go from woodworking to wood turning and they do small spindle work such as pins and decorative things, small things like that. When you have a small radius, you can turn, a lathe can be turned very quickly, such at 1,000, maybe 2, 3, 4,000 RPMs, which is very fast. And a general rule of thumb is no bowl should be going over 1,000 RPMs. Well, here's the problem. Most of those lathes do not have the ability to be turned down below 1,000 RPMs. And I hear stories of people sending bowl blanks and chunks of wood into ceilings and through doors because they're coming off the lathe so fast. And just imagine what that would do if it hit you. Well, we want to be safe when we're turning. I'm not going to go into all the details about lathe speed. I've got a video on that. You can check that out later. Just keep in mind that with bowls, we're turning much slower than we are with spindle turnings, and we need to dial down that RPM. That video will also share some information about how you can slow down a less expensive lathe that is direct driven. So check that out. Just know that when you're turning bowls on a lathe, you must turn a lot slower. The bigger the bowl, the slower it needs to be turning because you're going to have all kinds of issues. So just keep that in mind. This last rarely mentioned tip is super important for getting a nice smooth finish on your wood turnings. And until this clicks in your brain, you're probably going to have rough edges or a rough surface on your bowls. I know because I get emails all the time. I get emails from people that say, I'm sanding with 60 grit and I have to sand for about an hour and then I can change grits, but it still doesn't look good. Well, there's a good chance that you are not cutting in a supported grain direction. What? A supported grain direction. You heard me right. Essentially what it means is we want to be cutting with longer grain fibers ahead of the cut so that they're supporting the area that's being cut. Now, I go into great detail explaining everything you need to know about this right here. Just know that if you're turning your bowl and it looks sort of like what you want shape-wise, however, the surface is really rough, and I'm assuming that you're using a wood that typically will turn pretty smooth. Some woods, such as lumber that's used for construction, that's fir or pine, can be really rough surfaces. Those can be really nasty. There are certain species that don't turn well and don't cut smoothly, but for the most part, most hardwoods should have a nice smooth surface when you're done cutting them. They shouldn't need much sanding. You shouldn't be spending more than 15-30 minutes doing most of your sanding. Now, if you want to do a showpiece and you wanted to get something that's glass smooth, yes, you can sand longer, but your sanding should not take very long. If you're finding that you have to sand a long time, there's a good chance that you're not making supported grain cuts on the lathe. And it all has to do with the direction of the cut with the bowl gouge. And once you figure this out and once it clicks, you're going to see a night and day difference in the quality of the surface of your turnings. Whether you're just starting out or if you've been turning for a long time, my guess is there was something in there that lit a light in your mind and you said, oh, wow, I need to do something different here. Do me a favor and leave me a comment below and let me know what it was that sparked your curiosity and is going to make you do something a little bit different when you go out to the shop and you turn on the lathe the next time. All right, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, do me a huge favor and click that like button. Thank you. Also, be sure to subscribe and all that good stuff. And be sure to check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. Over there, I've got everything you need to know about turning wood bowls, including online courses that are going to help you accelerate your wood bowl turning skills. So check it out, turnawoodbowl.com. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. And as always, until next time, happy turning.